Which leads us to the final panel session, but this is absolutely key going forwards when we are looking at space futures, because as has been commented on over the last 2 days, this is a fast-moving technological domain, and it has to be. We cannot just think reactively. We've got to be thinking proactively when we're looking at the geopolitical and geostrategic landscape that we are in and the challenge space that is presented to us. So I'm delighted to welcome for the final panel, we're calling it our Space Dragon's Den. If I could invite panelists to come on stage, if we could give them a warm welcome, please, and then I'll make the introductions and hand over. Firstly, I'd like to introduce the chair of the panel, Professor Sir Martin Sweeting, who is the Executive Chairman of Surrey Satellite Technology Limited and also a distinguished professor at the University of Surrey. We have Anita Friend, who is Head of DASA, the Defence and Security Accelerator. Tom Purser, Business Partner, Air and Space Commercial X at the Ministry of Defence. Daniel Hilgert, Senior Space Coordinator at NATO Headquarters. Rebecca Huffee, who's the Space West Cluster Manager at the National Composites Centre. Dr. Paul Killworth, who is Deputy Chief Scientific Advisor for National Security for the United Kingdom. And Matt Wood, Head of Sales for Europe for BlackSky from Industry. Martin, over to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anu, and a very good afternoon now to everybody here. I was rather intrigued when I saw it that we were the Dragon's Den, and given that most of the earlier panels have certainly eaten all our sandwiches, I guess it's a pretty hungry bunch of dragons that we have here this afternoon. As Anu has introduced, the topic of this panel is that space is one of the fastest moving domains, and we're going to address that. But before we do that, I'd just like to add one comment from the pick up on points that came out this morning and a little bit yesterday, and that is the wider relevance of academia and indeed the general public in the future of space. And the Royal Society here in London, the Royal Society, for those who aren't familiar with it, is the UK Academy of Sciences, has just about completing an 18-month perspective on space in 2075. So that is looking beyond the immediate, SDR and all the procurement rounds, and not predicting the future, but saying, look, this is the direction of travel that space is sort of pointing. We won't be able to identify all the specific things that happen along the line, but these are the likely occurrences. And therefore, it would be, I think, beholden to government and also society in general to be aware of this, so that as we see things develop, as governments take policy and other decisions, they can do so against the sort of litmus test of how the future might look. And of course, that covers not just the civil domain, but very particularly the defence and security domain. And the Royal Society will publish this in hopefully around about the end of November, so I encourage you to pick up on that. It will be a public document. And whilst it does cover the broad range, both civil, it does also bring out many of the challenges that we will face as we move over the next 50 years through in-orbit manufacturing, through cislunar and lunar economy, and the future things across the domains, not just of technology, but also social activities and the implications on society. Because it's really important that we get the teenagers of today who will be alive in 2075 to engage with space, and they will be the taxpayers of the near future, and they will be able to also influence government direction. But coming back to the main topic of the dragons here, the technology that we've seen develop in space is across is certainly very multidisciplinary, and it's accelerating. And in fact, actually, if we look over the recent years, I would say that over the last perhaps 5 to 10 years, space has changed gear. there's been a real gear change and this has been stimulated very largely by the private sector and across a number of different developments, small, low cost, but yet capable satellites, the reduction of launch cost and the increased tempo of launch by SpaceX, as an example, and the whole so-called new space community that's grown up around it, so that the private sector investments and financial activity now is getting close to matching, if not exceeding, that of the public sector. And we have to think how the implications of that. And this has very greatly widened access to space because it's reduced the entry cost and complexity threshold, which of course is benefiting both our allies and our adversaries. And it's not just necessarily the big adversaries and competitors that we see. It also allows access to space by many smaller players, and whilst many of those are going to be positive contributions to the environment, it will perhaps also raise a different variety of risks that we might then come across. So then moving to the more local activities, Space Command has now acquired its first sovereign ISR capability with the launch of Tyche, and that provides a relatively modest in comparison to the established facilities, but capability, but again at a very modest cost, and it provides the UK with an independent ISR space asset and the ability now to contribute in ISR to the capacities of our allies. And this contribution is equally important as to the ability that it provides to the UK. So what's the challenge? Well, the challenge is that this is really, as I've outlined, a very fast-moving domain where the UK has limited resources and is space undoubtedly is going to be competing with other pressing requirements for the local government. And we have to consider what approach should the UK adopt in meeting its space sovereign needs, and how can it be a valued and meaningful contributor into allied space capabilities. Now, the UK has often demonstrated a very active history of innovation, and I would contend that this has been often stimulated by being lean and hungry. We've had very limited budgets, and we have to try and achieve the maximum effect with the minimum resources, and hopefully this is something that we'll be able to build on. So moving to my panel of dragons, I would like to raise the first question is, how do we collectively identify, then select, and then back effectively, and then exploit the latest game-changing technologies? So, Anita, perhaps I could pass that one to you to kick off.
Yeah, no, certainly. So as you've heard throughout the democratization of access to kind of science and technology and the increasing relevance of the civilian domain, I think probably the first point that I would make, and the experience that DASA has had, we find, fund and enable innovation for the benefit of national security, is that we need to be proactive in trying to widen our horizons about looking about what is actually possible. What do I actually mean about that? Well, actually, we need to break down the very first barrier to engagement with the civilian and the wider sector, which is awareness. Because we haven't historically engaged with that broad range of innovators. The very first challenge that we have to overcome is to be able to help people to join the dots, so to connect the things that they're working on with the problems that we are facing. So being able to articulate our problem sets in really clear English and being able to articulate those in an open and inclusive way. So at DASA, one of the things that we do is we have a network of innovation partners that link across all the regions. They're effectively a network of networks, so they're tapping into a whole range of other networks. And they're the first kind of friendly face for innovators on the ground to have that initial conversation around how the thing that they're working on might be relevant. And that's really important. The second thing is that we need to be able to do the selection and finding of innovation in a way that is transparent, a way that is fair, and a way that boosts confidence in the sector. So doing it in a way that is actually based around some selection criteria and that can be defended is equally important. So at DASA, what we do after having had those conversations, we run innovation calls where it's a competition for those that are putting in innovation against a particular challenge. And we select that on criteria of technical viability and sort of feasibility, using experts from across the government community that are both technical experts but also end users and sort of strategists. That is important, not just because it's a fair, transparent process, but because it actually boosts the confidence that there is actually interest in this technology. And then the final point that I would make is that it's really important in that selection process that we have both a push and a pull. So within DASA, we have an open call, which is open to any idea that can be submitted. We do the assessment and then we match it to customers within the national security landscape, in this context, space customers, space domain customers. And then we have a themed approach where it's the other way around. The customer comes to us with a problem. We then go and find innovation for that. Having both of those is critically important. Our open call has allowed innovators to demonstrate the feasibility of the thing that they're working on and to unlock further funding. So to give you an example of that, the University of Glasgow was funded through in 2019 through our open call to develop a fueling mechanism for rockets that consumed its own fuselage, so that made it a much more efficient way of launching rockets. They've been able to demonstrate the feasibility of that and have recently unlocked funding from the UK Space Agency and from UKRI and are going on to develop it. That wouldn't have happened if we hadn't been able to actually do that open call and proactively go out. So I think proactivity and making sure we have a push and pull would be my final point.
Well, thank you very much, Anita. I mean, Matt, how, from the point of view of the commercial side, how do you go about through that process?
Well, we come at it from a very different perspective, of course, as commercial, privately funded company. So we certainly do seek out those types of organizations, both in the UK and elsewhere in the world. The challenge that we have is that as an already established company, it's sometimes challenging to qualify for those, even though there is a need for us to be able to transmit what we're making to the customers.
And I suppose the follow-on from that is that once you've identified these technologies, how do we manage to integrate these and introduce them at pace into capabilities? Perhaps you'd like to just expand on that, Matt, before I pass it on to others to comment as well.
Yeah, I mean, especially with new technologies that the customer will not necessarily have experience with, you have an education process that you need to do with them, especially if you're changing the paradigm slightly of how they've used this type of technology before. So you have to have a way of giving them access to the capability to see what it can do for them, and then allowing them to understand how that can scale up within their organizations and across multiple organizations. The challenge for us from a commercial perspective is, of course, that we need to still make revenue at some point. And so the balance that I find myself striving for a lot is how do we manage to maintain enough innovation projects and balance them out with commercial customers who are actually willing to go into production.
Tom, would you like to pick up on that?
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah.
Looking down just to make sure I catch, because I know there are a couple of other hands can want to comment.
I think it goes two ways as well. That it's not only us being able to identify the technology, but also providing demand signal out to industry to allow them to invest in those innovation areas, rather than trying to take a scattergun approach to say, oh, this might fit this capability, or this square peg might fit into this round hole. Or if we can provide a demand signal from a defence side to industry, I think that additionally helps that acceleration process. Being able to provide industry with an idea of what we want it now, but also in the future, is definitely something that would pay benefits in the longer term, because industry can then invest in the appropriate technologies and innovate in those technologies to take that next step.
Rebecca, we'll go down the line. Rebecca.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting one, and I think I would go back to the kind of how do we identify. And so from an academic perspective, I think we could and should be doing more to leverage existing investment in space sector research. So I think the sector suffers from the fact that it's a very fragmented funding landscape, and we have a lot of research, space-related research being done under EPSRC or NERC, and it's not labelled as space research, and it's really, really challenging then, if we're thinking about that technology pull-through, to do that with industry, because it's not visible. And I would really like to see, going back to Stu Ather's point yesterday, a team captain who, with a national space research agenda that reflects the needs of defence within that, and then a clear funding pathway for organisations to take it from that low TRL research, to Doug Little's point yesterday, so we get this stuff beyond TRL4. And I think that's, from an academic perspective, I think that would really accelerate what we can do in terms of innovation and technologies for space.
And I'll certainly echo those comments on the complexity of the sector and funding arrangements. And I think as we go forward over the next couple of years, we really do need to work at how we simplify this, both in terms of internal customers within government, but also stakeholders and engagement from across industry. I know you've done some great work on your side in defence, working through that over the last couple of years. I wanted to touch on one approach we've developed in the UK since the last spending review and last integrated review, namely how do we use dual-use venture in the space. A number of you will have worked with the National Security Strategic Investment Fund, NSIF. For those who haven't, that model is around using funder funds and other approaches to take an early stake in emerging companies, showing defence national security's interest and backing for the sorts of their technologies they're taking forward in an early stage. Picking up on the need to generate revenue, we work on the principle that NSIF needs to use work programmes and other early stage customer first resort mechanisms to start to deliver capabilities and demonstrate that they work, de-risking it, both for other parts of national security and defence, but also the rest of the government and the wider customer set. That's been, I think, successful both in terms of addressing some of the technology challenges, but also changing part of the mindset we often have within government towards risk. By NSIF bringing together some of the venture capitalist models, combined with that commercial mindset, it allows us to think about risk as a good thing. Where we're seeing technological risk, that is generating an upside, that we may have capabilities faster ahead of the adversary, capabilities that can give the UK an export edge. And that redefinition of risk from being a bad thing to be managed down to risk on occasion being embraced as a way to make fast progress, I think has been really powerful. I do attribute to the team taking that particular bit of cultural change forward.
And Daniel, from a NATO investment standpoint, what would your view be on that?
Yeah, I think, first of all, thanks so much for inviting me to that panel. I think at NATO, is probably quite known, we've established this new DIANA organization, the Defence Innovation Accelerator, which is actually headquartered here in London. We have a NATO Innovation Fund as well. So that's all great. So a lot of opportunities for disruption when it comes to technology development. But I think what we really need to focus now is on the adoption piece. And I think that came through a little bit by the other panelists. And I want to take a step further and talk a little bit about commercial integration more broadly. We at NATO, we've undergone a bit of a journey since the beginning of this year. We've initiated a commercial space dialogue where we really wanted to put the spotlight on the commercial sector, on industry, and hear about some of the challenges, some of the struggles they have when it comes to working with defense and helping to integrate commercial solutions. And I think what we found was in no way surprising. I think challenges we see in any other domain when it comes to our procurement models being outdated, very slow, commercial partners really struggling to understand the complexity of defense organizations, of NATO, of national organizations, that there's no venue for testing and experimentation to actually bring the equipment into an operational environment and to see if things work. The high levels of classification, the lack of information flow, and one really important element as well, the threats that they experience when they partner with defense. That's a really, really important element that we want to talk a bit more about. And as I said, this was not surprising to anyone at NATO. It wasn't surprising to allies. But I think what was a bit unusual is that we really tried to rip the bandage off and make this really, really visible and transparent to the nations, to NATO. And NATO as an enterprise is struggling themselves to engage with industry. When we do procurements, or before we even start, we do these RFIs, long templates, long lists that we send to industry where we want their answers. And much of the information that we get is not really usable. So it would be awesome, if we could just have a little bit of funding that we can give industries to come into our exercises, our experimentation venues, and see if these things work, if they address our requirements. So NATO is a great organization because we have 32 allies, but it's also a challenging organization when it comes to driving change. There's consensus decision-making. That's why it's really important for us to put industry at the center. So we're now developing this commercial space strategy for NATO, which we also see a little bit as a North Star for some of the allies to see what they can adopt within their national frameworks. And what we really want to look to achieve with this strategy is to tackle these issues. More operational testing environments with commercial, finding ways to protect and defend commercial partners, new organizations at NATO that help better connect with commercials, help them be better prepared for working with NATO, and also to create more non-classified environments where we can work together. So a lot of things in the pipeline. We're getting a little bit of pushback from some nations that are asking, why are we doing this on space? Why? I mean, these challenges are cross-cutting all domains. Why are we doing this on space? And I think what's really important here is that the commercial space sector is a new kid on the block. We as an organization have the unique opportunity to get things right with industry, to help them work better with us, and to harvest this diversity. And again, it was mentioned, I think, by some of the generals before, NATO cannot own and operate its own space assets. That's a bit of a limitation if you think about autonomy, but it's also empowering because we need to either rely on national contribution or commercial. So this commercial element is really important, and to get this right through the strategy that's upcoming for February next year is really important.
Yeah, thank you. And I think sort of building on that, I'd like to sort of just address, how does industry and academia support the military defense requirements as they come up? And part of that is having some form of long-term program where you can see a roadmap. Maybe the road might deviate from year to year. They may go faster or slower, but at least there is a direction of travel that people can see both in industry and in academia what is likely to be required, and therefore they can plan their resources, human resources as well as financial and technical resources to meet that. And I wonder how we can do that better. And also, is there a role there, or how important is it to have an ingredient of technology and capability demonstration along the road, so that the new technologies, as they come up, get introduced quickly, assessed, and then hopefully refined and before they're brought into full operational capability? Who would like to pick that one up?
I can take a perspective on that. I think picking up on my earlier points about that kind of proactive engagement, for me, it's about us moving from a transactional relationship with industry and academia to a proper partnership. And some of the points have been touched on already, that we need to have this clear golden thread from that early research right the way through to actual capability adoption, and importantly from an industrial perspective to actual contracts and to money, because obviously they need to make profit. And we've talked about how we need to think about how we support business growth and how we attract in investment. All that requires integration, and it requires coherence across the system. So if I was to say the two things that would be most important to me, one would be cohering the system to actually connect around missions, to actually make sure that we can have this golden thread from early research right the way through to capability adoption, and to have an integrated approach, which is actually about bringing together different disciplines from across government, industry and academia that allow us to fuse all the aspects together that we need. So that will be technology development, it will be technology demonstrations to demonstrate feasibility. It will also be helping to connect innovators to their market so that they can understand what does the space domain market actually look like, and how might that work alongside their civilian market, and how does that actually form a sustainable business proposition, which actually then starts to de-risk them as an investment opportunity, which will enable them to actually attract the external investment that they need in order to be able to scale and grow. And also in that integration, helping suppliers of all different sizes from academia and industry to identify potential partnership opportunities. Because actually we need the strengths of the small SMEs and the micros and the creativity, along with the mid-tiers and the primes, to work alongside each other to really be able to navigate the very best innovation into our supply chain at a point where we can actually benefit for it from a space perspective, but also from a UK prosperity perspective. So that integration and thinking about how we help organisations from different disciplines, different backgrounds, how we help them to understand one another, because actually partnership depends on understanding and it depends on trust. So actually thinking about that throughout our whole process, I think would be important also.
Yeah, and I think that there's two elements of this that I think it's talked about in one of the previous panels. It's around procurement process as well, that yes, you can have all the best technology in the world, but if it takes 3 years to get into deployment, that technology is already obsolete or going obsolete by the time it gets to the front line. But this is why Commercial X was set up. We look at how we can deliver that innovation, that R&D to the warfighter at pace. You know, what can we do to speed up that procurement process? You know, do we grant our commercial team special freedoms? You know, how do we do this to enable not only the commands to keep up with the pace of technology, but also to keep up with the pace from the private sector and industry in how quickly they can develop? You know, government has notoriously been slow at sometimes adopting technology purely just because it takes 9 months, a year, 18 months to get that technology into full operating capability sometimes. Whereas we were set up to try and address that and to try and develop and rapidly progress that TRL level development so that the warfighter and the commands can get stuff to their front lines at speed.
Rebecca? Yeah.
And I think they're just kind of building on that a bit. I think the Procurement Act will hopefully allow SMEs to be able to bid into some of these opportunities as well. And then kind of going back to the old piece around what we need to do in terms of academia, I think we've got to recognise that the university funding model is really quite broken, and it causes problems and isn't at odds with what the defence needs are, because ultimately the consumer base is the students, and so international student recruitment can be quite damaging in terms of what defence needs are. And then I think what I think is probably not maybe necessarily recognised within this room particularly so well is there is a definite anxiety within universities to openly engage and talk about defence-related research. Some will actually not get involved in defence-related research at all, and some will do it but not talk about it. And that's a problem, because we need our universities to be thought leaders, and we need them to change. We're preaching to the choir here. We all know what space does for us. We all know why defence is important. But actually, we need to change society's view on what defence is, that actually it's not about tanks and planes and missiles. It's actually about how our adversaries are looking to destabilise our economies and our society. And that is not understood. That's when I speak to parents on the school run, that's not what people understand. And I think we need to go out, and that's, we talked about homework yesterday. I think that's something as individuals we should be talking about it in our bike clubs or kayaking groups to make people understand that better.
No, I couldn't agree more. And just reverting back to the comment I made earlier about the Royal Society perspective, in that perspective, we actually have commissioned a science fiction writer to write some short stories specifically targeted at teenagers, looking at that range over through to 2075 And it's not just addressed at, HMG and everybody else, and it's also addressed to society in general, because unless we can get everybody thinking about what space is likely to do for us, like the internet has changed our lives, space will do the same thing. We need to be thinking about it now, so we might make a slightly better job of it when the time comes. Any other comments on? Yes.
I think I was going to underline that point about mission. When I look at the challenges of doing multi-stakeholder governance, very much the successful model you've described, usually it's because we're able to communicate what that mission is, what we're really trying to accomplish. I mean, I've seen some wonderful examples of this in the net zero community, explaining how often very technical aspects of our space approaches will inform our ability to manage environmental goals. But for national security and defence, we have some brilliant stories to tell about what space capabilities, space resilience means in terms for our citizens and users can understand. And for me, that breaks through the barriers. It breaks through the barriers of taking risk around procurement. We turn to our political masters and explain we'd like them to take more risk around procurement decisions in order to achieve a large mission goal that will benefit the UK and allies. They're far more likely to say yes. When we turn to academics, if we can thoroughly explain the end use cases, they'll come with us. It transforms a commercial transactional relationship to one between partners. Some of the excellent work the UKI has done within the current framework around sandpits, bringing together academics who are uniquely excited about their areas of research, but can suddenly see how it can be used at the front line. We can do that, and I think this community around, here today and virtually, we're at the forefront of that. If we can't leave here and tell the stories, linking the mission, the purpose about how we intend to keep the UK safe and secure, achieve growth, link that to technologies, we're failing in our pitch, and I think we can do that even more powerfully as a community.
And I think if we're going to do that and keep the momentum, correspondingly, we need to have for our young people, both in academia and in industry, regular opportunities to be able to see how the work that they do gets demonstrated in orbit or on the ground, whichever part of the space chain it's in, so that they're not doing it and working on a 10-year or 20-year program, which they might complete once in their career. The concept should be they should be able to see a project through over the course of a 1.5 to 2.5 year timescale, so they can have the rapid learning process and then accelerate the business. Anu, just to wake you up there. At some point, I'd like to take use of Q&A, and I don't want to run out of time for the Q&A. So being as the maestro of timing, perhaps you can make sure that but if it's now or later, we have enough time for some Q&A.
We actually, I mean, time-wise, we have about 24 minutes and we have a lot of questions. So, Martin, do you want me to open up now?
No, let's fire away with the questions and see where they...
Martin, what I'll do is I'll fill them to you to distribute unless somebody wants to jump in, if that's okay.
If anybody wants to jump in, put your hand up, and if you don't, I will finger you.
Right.
I don't like the sound of that.
In the nicest possible manner.
Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go Slido, and then I'll go audience, Slido, audience. So I'm going to start with Slido. Good question here from Bill Dormer from Nova Systems. We're here in the IET. The first space race brought us the pocket calculator. Today, our mobile phones are said to have greater computing power than was available to that first space race. So what does the panel foresee as future investable technologies for citizens on Earth from the next space race? And that's my emphasis on investable technologies.
Before you get the... Right, let's go right to the end, Dan.
I mean, as I mentioned, I mean, this is there's so much movement in that sector. There's such a variety of technologies that we can invest into, but that's not really the question. The question is, how can we integrate them and how can we adopt them? That's really what keeps me wake up at night.
Anybody else want to pick that one? Yes?
Yeah, I think there's also, the question is around what do the commands want, really? I mean, it's not something that we can probably answer directly, but what do we want for now but in the future? From a defence point of view, what technologies do we want suppliers to be focusing on? I think that's something that needs to come from the commands to have a think about, to say, where do I want to be in 5-10 years' time, which I know is what they're doing. But that then pushes that demand signal out to industry to say, look, we're attempting to do this. This is the way we want to go. And essentially, I think you said earlier, Martin, provide that roadmap then to say, well, look, I want to get here. How do I get here? And then that's where the investment and the innovation comes from.
And I think, again, just to re-emphasise what has been said several times in the last day and a bit, and that is that industry and academia and the defence community need to work together. And I know there are some lines which we can't cross at various times, but to the greatest possible extent, if each of the communities understand what their capabilities, what their resources are, and where they want to be, we're likely to get a better result. And so it means we've really got to find a way of working better collectively.
And Martin, if I can just come back to this, because in a way, this is a shared responsibility to drive that change. I think it's easy. I mentioned this earlier. Tom mentioned this earlier. Procurement systems are broken. Government is too slow, and so on and so on. That's all true. But I think it's clear that commercial and also academia have also responsibility in this game on a wide range of things. For example, what we see right now at NATO, I think this is different procurement organizations within the nations as well. There are so many offers coming in, and there are a lot of overhyped promises that come from commercial entities about this is what we're working on. We can deliver X, Y, Z. I think industry needs to also be a bit more realistic about what they can offer and when are they at this stage. And I think governments also need to put in a bit of a filter in terms of seeing, does this company actually have the funding and the capabilities to deliver? Another thing, and that's really important, not only in space, for defense primes to understand this is a diverse market and that they need to play with others when it comes to, taking contracts from defense. So can we, as defense organizations, for example, mandate to have a 2-3% in our contracts that is carved out for smaller businesses? Are the defense primes happy? If that's not always the case, so I think that's something we need to work on. And we can talk about threats as well. Mentioned this earlier. I think also commercial partners need to understand that space has changed and that they need to invest into their own cyber resilience measures and so on and so on. So again, there's just a point to say this is a shared responsibility to drive this change.
I think you highlighted an interesting point there, Dan.
Pointing the finger at you.
Yeah, I know. Don't worry. I felt the finger. There has been a tendency within the new space economy companies to exactly overpromise and underdeliver. I'm certainly seeing now more resistance from customers to adopt new technologies or capabilities until it's actually available. 5 years ago, that was not so much the case. And I think that's industry's been its own worst enemy in that case, just in terms of having a high vision of what they can achieve and then technologically achieving a lot of it, but not necessarily what they said they were going to achieve. So as industry, certainly within BlackSky, we take it very seriously to be conscious of what we're saying to the customers in terms of the capability that we will deliver and proving that we deliver it. So I think in terms of the investable technologies, just to go back to the original question, I think that it's very much a case of people need to be thinking about how can they use the technologies that are being developed by space industry to facilitate outcomes on Earth, because ultimately that's what we're doing with all of this. Yes, a lot of the technology is happening in space, but it's delivering the effect on Earth. So I think we need to be looking at how can we take advantage of these technologies that are being developed and use that to benefit, whether it's defense or commercial or academia, and bringing those things together.
So, Rebecca, were you... No, I thought it was somebody who was like, oh, okay, it was your finger.
I'll pick up on that same investable question. So, first of all, small print. I'm not qualified to give investment advice, so don't follow this too closely. But in my head, you can think of this as a wide spectrum of things we could be looking at. I'm always interested as a chief scientific advisor in where technologies overlap. So I love areas like space technology overlapped with quantum sensing. Some really exciting things going on there. And there's similar examples where you get the prism of multiple technologies, different sorts of industries, create some really unique opportunities. But I think I'd be missing a trick if I didn't emphasize just how important constant improvement for the traditional technology sets are, particularly satellite communications, constantly improving those, whether that be for communications, space control, other sorts of mechanisms, is absolutely crucial. And that's a traditional area with some cutting-edge improvements. And we need to be able to tackle both the sort of space and quantum end of the spectrum, but also things like satellite communications. And critically, I think as government, we need to be able to ensure there's enough talent in the UK and enough trusted capital to do all of that. Success for me is about making sure that regardless of the type of opportunity you have in the space industry from a national security and defence perspective, that you can find the people with the right skills, you can find the capital, the ways into government and the customer routes, and that we can do all of that successfully. I don't want us to have to make trade-offs.
Okay. Thank you. Anu, what's up next?
Yeah, so next I'll get questions from the floor. I'm just looking. I've got a question over here. If I can have the microphones come over, please. And again, if we can just keep the contexts sort of concise, please.
Thank you. I'm Sho from Huffee Nuclear Technologies, and my question is trying to interrogate more of the demand signal side. What about creating partnerships and co-creating demand signals in partnership with industry so that you don't get that dissonance between industry selling solutions that sort of government don't want? What have you done? What can be done? Best practices, examples, or challenges I'd be keen to hear when it comes to co-creating demand signals so that we're in sync.
I can touch on some of that. It's not specific to space, but on that very point, we're just about to run a pilot that does exactly what you've just described, which is to do early market engagement with industry and academia, as well as cohering the key customers across government. We're actually looking at drones, not specifically space, but to do exactly that, so that we can, and the idea behind the hypothesis that we're really testing out is that by doing that, we can form a much better partnership with industry and academia that is informed better by the possibilities. Because I think we've talked about we absolutely have to go after the things that address our missions and our problems, and that has to be the driver. But we also need to ensure that we're not limiting our options by only looking at the things that we think are possible, as opposed to the things that might actually be possible. And similarly, I challenge a point that was made earlier. I think we need to think about the market is a dynamic thing. So our SMEs now will become our mid-tiers and our primes if they're successful. So the fact that they can't deliver now, but they have something that is really promising and really interesting shouldn't be a blocker to stop us from going after it. We need to think about how we support economic growth and how we support technology development at the same time, informed by that co-creation around the problem that you just described.
Yeah, and just following on for that point, I think that leads on to a good point about access for suppliers to defence, because ordinarily, you know, how many government procurement frameworks are there out there? There's, 20, 30, 40 plus. Suppliers sometimes look at it, especially SMEs, and think, which one do I best go with? Now, hopefully the new Procurement Act will help solve that with the dynamic markets and the rest of it. I know, there's stuff being worked on internally within commercial teams to look at how we solve that, but I think that then leads into that access point around, well, yes, you've got great technology, but actually, how do I engage with defence? Even to the point, I think, around across MOD, I think there's 20 or 25 different innovation cells. How do we as defence actually join up in a much more coherent way to give the market that signal?
I mean, I was struck, and I can't remember the name of the program, but in the US, the DoD has a program where it invites SMEs to come forward, bring your ideas. They have a quick look at it. They say yep or no. Sign a contract, and you get paid within 3 days. Relatively modest sums, but nevertheless, it really works. And this is a fantastic catalyst for SMEs to be able to demonstrate what capability they have, and for, in that case, the DoD to see the potential impact for it, and then whether they want to build on it further. Next.
If I may, we have that model in the UK. So our open call does exactly that, the DASA open call. So that is our open mechanism for being able to go out with modest sums where academia and industry can put in any idea that they think is relevant to defence and security, and we fund it quickly.
You get a contract and funding all, as I say, with it.
Yep, and 50% of our success stories come from the open call. It works.
So that helps me shape your initial response and then your follow-up, Anita, and Martin, what you've just said, choosing this question, which is anonymous. One issue Daniel mentioned was lack of testing facilities available to commercial organisations. So, if we're going to draw this in, put that capabilities, how can we support? With the development of the NATO commercial space strategy, are you looking to build more testing facilities or to make existing facilities more readily available?
And that's focused in the UK, I presume?
Yes.
Certainly there have been national facilities that have been developed just in the recent years for large-scale space tests. So I think the short answer is yes. The extent to which that goes, I would be interested in other people's comments. Is it sufficient?
I don't think it is, and I think one of the issues that I know that SMEs and startups that I work with is there just isn't the capacity within those existing facilities for them to have access to it, and it's often dominated by the primes and their access to those types of facilities. And I think actually the SCIF funding has been really helpful in helping develop out new facilities, but I definitely think there's opportunity to look at that and think about, yes, there might need to be duplication of facilities because there is not enough capacity within the UK.
I mean, there was an exercise carried out, and it's quite a number of years ago in the UK, which went through and actually identified all the facilities around the UK system. And it was quite surprising what lurked where. And I wonder to what extent actually SMEs are just simply unaware of facilities that would be useful to them at the right scale that might exist, particularly in allied sectors, not necessarily the space sector, but in the automotive sector or others. They have various test facilities, and I wonder whether we need a more national register of useful facilities that could be made more available.
So yes and yes. There's no doubt that we've got a range of brilliant facilities for prototyping, accelerators, all of that across the country. But even within the relevant bits of national security and defence sector, we don't necessarily know where they all are. And if we don't know, it's asking a bit much for external players to find it. I talked a bit about simplification earlier. I think we need to get to the point where you could pitch up as a SME to any of us from government on this panel, and you could have access to our combined facilities. That is the state we should be aiming towards. I think we would love to have more investment in this. I'm conscious when I turn to Treasury and a spending review, they're likely to insist I make best use of my current facilities before building more. That's entirely reasonable. But I think there's something about linking these types of infrastructure, these sorts of platforms to the growth agenda that Anita mentioned. This isn't just about bringing forward capabilities. It's about our ability to create new sectors, new markets, manage those demand signals, and being able to plug in those facilities, those capabilities into that wider statecraft of growth, I think is going to be crucial during the next round. And there's a lot more we could do that, building on some of the success stories from the last 3.5 years, scaling those up and really making this a national endeavour linked in turn to the NIF and Diana and the NATO frameworks.
And indeed, over to Dan.
Yeah, I want to maybe zoom out a little bit, and I think the really key ingredient or the key glue in that triangle between industry, defense, and academia is trust. And what I often hear from some nations and also from NATO, I think there is sometimes a bit of a concern if actually commercial can deliver. If they can trust their data, their algorithms, if they have the cybersecurity measures, and so on and so on. And I think the main, one of the key ways to build trust is to exercise together, to bring commercial in, to train the way we fight, to really know how things operate when the fight starts way before that point. So I think that is really, really important. And I think that's why, I think this was one of the lessons of Russia's war against Ukraine, to see the benefits from commercial, but also see some of the limitations. And, we all followed the discussions with Starlink and some decisions that were taken there. But again, building trust, we do this through exercising together, through testing and experimentation. And that's really, really important. And something we want to push forward in NATO and then shine through the alliance.
I couldn't agree more. Working together on focused activities really is what creates the trust and the understanding. And I think in the discussions that we've had in the last day and a half, we've seen a move away from perhaps the old well, I was going to call it almost the sort of Cold War mentality of, industry and defence, and there's a sort of tiny little peephole through which, the conversation occurs, to a much more integrated approach, and we just need to take it a little bit further. Hello.
Okay, I was going to open up to the floor again. I'm just looking, and I can see a gentleman over here, please. If I could have a microphone over here. Apologies that I was slightly blinded by the lights there. And
Thank you. Alan Thompson from Skyrora. I did actually put a question in the Slido as well, but the question I'd like to ask in this context is more about continuing from Daniel's point about trust. Does the panel have any recommendations how industry can enable emerging launch, which will underpin assured access to space for the United Kingdom, and recommendations how to build the trust and education in the regulator to allow this activity to take place? We've been now 3 years into the new regulatory regime. We've had one license issued to launch from the United Kingdom, and we are now at a stage where the regulator is actively refusing to engage with industry to learn the activity. Is it a question of government investment to unlock the regulator's ability to engage and learn? Or what's the challenge? Is it an opportunity to develop these regulatory sandpits coming out of the regulatory review to be able to share and build that trust in a regime, in an area where we can talk about ConOps and develop this? Or is it, what in the panel's view is the key factor to unlock launch, which could be a huge new market opportunity for the United Kingdom, both for defence and civil? Just interested. Thank you.
So while my panel members think about who wants to pick that one up, it's quite clear that with technology and the application of that technology moving so quickly, that the regulatory and the policy regimes cannot keep pace, and therefore they need to accelerate or endeavour to accelerate at a similar plate, and that means more resource required. And I guess it just takes longer than we would like for that to ramp up in order to be able to meet the policy and regulatory demands. One hopes that is a converging line, that the growth of technology and the ability for the regulatory side to catch up on that is going to converge. Otherwise, as you see, with SpaceX, they set the rules in many cases ahead of the regulatory environment. I think we're not quite in that same position, and therefore it's perhaps impeding the development of that particular development. Who else would like to comment on that? Daniel.
So, it's quite interesting. We're seeing, this is not only a British problem, but it's a problem that we see across the alliance. So there's so many efforts and investments in spaceports, different commercial launch providers across the alliance. So, rationally thinking, wouldn't it make sense that nations come together, talk about these issues that they have within the national frameworks, look at what regulations they're putting up and see, okay, this works here, some lessons we can take from this nation, from Norway, from Sweden, and adopt it in this framework. I think this is it's important, this partnership, and not just to think in your own national framework. And at NATO right now, we're developing a new multinational program, so where it's not 32 allies, but really a coalition of smaller coalitions coming together. Think about responsive space capabilities, where some nations are putting forward their spaceports and launch capabilities and satellite providers, and really look at interoperability aspects, standards, how to create system of systems, and also look at the regulatory lessons. So I think this is a really, really powerful way of trying to solve things that you experience in a national framework.
Anybody else want to comment?
I can't comment on the specifics, but I think a more general learning from innovation more generally, it comes back to this mission point and to integration. So one of the kind of my guiding principles, if you like, for innovation is don't just assemble the advocates and those that have got really great ideas on how to do change. Actually also assemble your naysayers early and talk to them, because they will have a reason as to why they are operating in the way that they do. And actually having that conversation early at the beginning, I think is really critical, because that's when you start to be able to unlock some of this and to actually make changes. So that would be part of my recommendation.
I know, I
think Anita just picked up on a point that I wanted to bring out of the trust comment that you made. The communication is key to building trust. And it means communicating not just between industry and academia or between industry and government, it's across the government and across academia and across industry as well. And so I think the better that we can make that communication loop, whatever format that needs to take, whether it's events like this or meetings or frameworks, that's the key to building the trust, because that gives you the opportunity to have that conversation and, as you say, meet the naysayers halfway and understand what their reasoning is for doing so, because they're not doing it just because they don't like it. Well, they might be, but
usually
probably not.
Most likely not. I know, it'd be nice to see if we fit in another.
Yeah, we've got one more question. Just before we do that, can I just give one personal observation on that, which is, and I might seem heretical for saying this, when we were talking about trust and we were talking about sometimes the overselling from industry, one of the challenges we have, I'd say collectively in the sector, is sometimes we are real advocates for our solutions. We are sometimes guilty, perhaps, of overselling. And sometimes just because there is a space-based solution, it doesn't necessarily mean that the space-based solution is the best one. And I do sometimes look, and I'm not going to name any examples, but I sometimes look and I think, look, we all love space. We're all putting this forward, but are we being objective when we're critiquing the role of space? Let me get back on track here. We've got time for one more question. I'm going to go to... The panel has spoken about what we need to think about and do better so we can innovate faster. Can you give any case studies about some successful space innovations that we've already made at pace, either in the UK or NATO? Now, I can think of one methodologically going back a long time ago involving somebody on the panel, but are there other examples? So we're talking about that need. So some UK or NATO-wide examples where within 3 years, as you mentioned it, Martin, you know, concept, rapid development, or maybe 5 years. Anything springs to mind?
So I'll give you one that's not necessarily a complete innovation, but it's a good demonstration of the flexibility that industry can have in responding to customer needs, which I think is one of the crucial things that we bring to the table. So when Ukraine happened, we were preparing to launch the last 2 satellites of our constellation, and we had them planned for a particular mid-inclined orbit, mid-latitude inclined orbit. And one of our customers came to us and said, it would be really great if you had more coverage over this particular latitude that happens to go right over Ukraine, because obviously we could see what was coming. And within 6 weeks, we were able to change our launch to launch into a new orbit to provide that to the customer. That's a process that normally takes months and months, and we did it within 6 weeks. So I think that's the kind of flexibility that industry can provide, as long as the customer comes to us and talks to us about it and helps, say, is this even possible? So that's the type of innovation that I think industry can bring. The other thing I would say is that, everything we build is driven by customer demand. There is a tendency, we were talking about this in the green room, there's a tendency amongst engineers to go and build cool things because they like to build cool things. But the reality is that a successful business has to build something that customers want to buy.
And I'd argue, actually, there's a lot of downstream on the app side, what we're doing with the data that is responsive. Rebecca, did you have a comment you were going to make? You look like you're about to.
No.
Not going to put you on the spot there.
You said you had an example.
Yeah.
Okay, so it'll actually come with my roundup comments, because we're running out of time. Firstly, but there is a question. It's going to be directed at you, Martin, actually. So firstly, thank you very much, panel, for sharing your perspectives. 2 things I want to take away, or want to thank you for as well. What's come through at last? We've mentioned the role of academia at various times yesterday, but it's been subliminal. It's brought up. I think all of you have been really, really highlighting that. So thank you again. A critical part of the triangle to come forward. And I suppose just as the final conclusions, I would say, looking back 45, 48 years ago, but it's a question, Martin, when you were, as an academic, looking at the opportunities that led to UOSat-1 and the small satellite revolution that's happened, back then, I think it was 1981 or so, were you also thinking ahead to the potential for this, or was this really very much there's an opportunity space we can really push on here to ride shares and use COTS technologies? I'm interested.
I wish I could say that it was all a deep laid plan that would ultimately end up in new space, but that would be untrue. I think at that time it was an opportunity because there was the confluence of the development of microelectronics, which all of a sudden was able to shrink the size of a satellite, but increase its capability to be able to get that magic formula to match of cost, utility, time scale, and size. And I did think that it had a future, although most people at the time told me to go out and get a proper job, which I didn't. So I could see there was a hazy future, which I believed in, but I couldn't say, in all honesty, that I saw where it would be today.
Thank you, Martin. Colleagues, could we show our appreciation in the customary manner?
Thanks you very much.
And that takes us to lunch. Just a couple of notices I want to give. Firstly, as a parish notice, lunch is being served upstairs in the Maxwell Library as well as downstairs. And finally, it has been a very intensive day and a half. We've had lots of ideas. We are going along a narrative pathway. We are getting all of the ingredients we need. This afternoon's sessions are where everything will be coming together. We've got a keynote from Tim Marshall. And I think why I'm valuing this, not only as a reader of several of his studies, very often when we look outside our sector, we can get a really objective view of what we are about. But I think crucially, that is being followed by Major General Tedman as the UK Space Command commander, who'll be able to integrate all of the perspectives he's taken on board and really give his perspective on what we have achieved collectively and what our homework tasks going forward are at pace. And I would urge you, if possible, to make sure we can stay there so that we can bring together all of the individual strands that we've been weaving together collectively. It's absolutely crucial. So thank you very much, everyone. Lunch will be being served. If I could see you back here at 14:20, which gives us about 55 minutes. Thank you, colleagues.